The Angles, Saxons, and Jutes were part of the broader Germanic peoples, a group of tribal societies living in the northern regions of Europe, specifically modern-day Denmark, Germany, and the Netherlands. These tribes were initially shaped by their interactions with Roman civilization. Some were raiders, others traders, and some had settled into farming communities along the rivers and coastal regions. The Saxons, known for their fierce seafaring nature, lived along the northwest coasts of Germany. Their culture was characterized by pagan beliefs, including a pantheon of gods like Thor and Odin, and a strong warrior ethos. The Angles, originating from Schleswig-Holstein in northern Germany, shared many cultural traits with the Saxons, including their reliance on agriculture and tribal governance. The Jutes, who came from the Jutland Peninsula, were smaller in number, but equally involved in raids and migrations. Hey there! I'm glad you're here. In today's video, I will take you through the timeline of the Anglo-Saxons, from their arrival in Britain as mercenaries, through their settlement and the rise of powerful kingdoms, to the impact of Viking invasions and the eventual unification of England. We'll explore how these events shaped the destiny of a nation and laid the foundations for modern Britain. Let us know in the comments where you're watching from. And if you haven't subscribed yet, we'd love to hear why. Drop a comment and tell us. We really appreciate your feedback. Don't forget to hit that subscribe button for more deep dives into history.
Their cultures were defined by oral traditions that glorified heroism and the value of family and kinship. These societies were ruled by chiefs or kings who maintained power through a combination of personal prowess and the loyalty of their warriors. These tribes had long been in conflict with neighboring Celtic tribes and the expanding Roman Empire. The Roman Empire, however, was both a challenge and a catalyst. On one hand, the Roman Empire's growing borders restricted Germanic tribes from expanding. On the other, it also set into motion a chain of migrations, as the Romans' weakening hold on the continent in the 4th and 5th centuries created opportunities for new peoples to move westward. The fall of the Roman Empire in the early 5th century triggered a massive wave of migrations throughout Europe. Climate change, the pressure of Huns and other invaders, and the collapse of Roman authority created a destabilizing effect in the Germanic regions. As Roman Britain faltered, the Anglo-Saxons found themselves in a position to take advantage of the political vacuum. By the late 5th century, these tribes saw a window of opportunity to claim new territory that was vulnerable, unprotected, and rich with resources. Their reasons for migrating to Britain were both practical and opportunistic. The Anglo-Saxons were driven by the hope of new land to farm, the promise of wealth, and the need to escape the pressures of conflicts at home. More than simply a matter of survival, the migration was a strategic move to secure new territory at a time when their homeland was becoming increasingly unstable. The Roman withdrawal from Britain in 410 AD left the region vulnerable to new migrations, as well as to internal turmoil and external threats. The Roman Empire, having once controlled much of Europe and Britain, began to unravel under the pressures of barbarian invasions and political instability. As Roman legions were called back to defend the empire's borders, Britain was left without the military support it had relied on for over 300 years. The Romanized Britons were left with an incomplete defense system and an over-reliance on centralized Roman authority. Their cities, fortifications, and roads, which had been maintained by Roman hands, began to fall into disrepair. Without the Roman military presence and administrative control, local tribal leaders and noble families were forced to assume more control, but they were ill-prepared to defend the region from the growing threats beyond their borders.
At this moment of vulnerability, the Anglo-Saxons, along with other Germanic tribes, seized the opportunity. The Anglo-Saxon migration to Britain can be seen as a direct response to the power vacuum created by the Roman departure. Initially, the Anglo-Saxons arrived as mercenaries, hired to defend Britain from other invaders such as the Scots and Picts. However, as the native Britons weakened under the strain of attacks and internal conflict, the Anglo-Saxons began to settle the land, pushing further into the southeast and eventually creating strongholds that would serve as bases for further expansion. The Anglo-Saxons capitalized on this power vacuum by taking advantage of Britain's lack of centralized authority and military structure. With their warrior cultures and seafaring skills, they were able to expand rapidly, establishing footholds and ultimately creating the first Anglo-Saxon kingdoms. The initial settlements in Britain were typically small, coastal villages established by the Anglo-Saxons in the southeast of the island, where they first landed and began to establish their foothold. They initially settled in the regions of Kent, Sussex, and Essex, where they could use their maritime expertise to land quickly and access the fertile lands of the south coast. The Anglo-Saxons built wooden huts and fortified settlements, utilizing natural resources to create defensive structures. These early settlements were built with the intention of defending against local Celtic tribes, as well as providing a base for further expansion. The Anglo-Saxon society was initially tribal, with chieftains or kings exercising authority over their followers. These leaders were often responsible for both military strategy and social order, maintaining the loyalty of their warriors through the promise of land and loot. Clans or tribal units worked the land together, and the Anglo-Saxon society was based on strong kinship bonds that revolved around mutual support and protection.
The interaction between the Anglo-Saxons and the native Celtic Britons was complex. In many areas, the Anglo-Saxons did not eradicate the native populations, but instead interacted and integrated with them. In some regions, Anglo-Saxon leaders married into local Celtic families, forging alliances and blending cultural practices. However, as the Anglo-Saxons established dominance, many native Celtic Britons were either pushed westward into Wales or forced into servitude under the new Anglo-Saxon rulers. There were also cases where tensions flared into violence, particularly as the Anglo-Saxon settlements began to expand into the territory once controlled by the Britons. The role of the tribal leaders during the Anglo-Saxon migration was absolutely crucial. These chieftains were not simply military leaders, they were visionaries who saw the opportunity for their tribes to gain land, power, and prestige in the wake of Roman Britain's collapse. Their ability to unite their people under a single cause was one of the defining characteristics of the Anglo-Saxon migration. Leaders such as Cerdic of Wessex and El of Sussex played vital roles in organizing their tribes for the migration. Their charisma, leadership skills, and ability to rally warriors to their cause were pivotal in motivating large numbers of people to undertake such a dangerous journey. These leaders often promised land and plunder in return for loyalty, effectively binding their followers through the prospect of economic gain. The shared goal of establishing strongholds in Britain provided a unifying cause, and tribal leaders understood that by securing territory, they could build long-term power for themselves and their descendants.
The leadership of these tribal chiefs also involved diplomacy. As the Anglo-Saxons expanded, they often engaged in negotiations with other tribes or local Celtic rulers, securing land and sometimes forging temporary alliances. The leadership of these tribes was marked by a careful balance of military might, social cohesion, and political maneuvering. Ultimately, the success of the Anglo-Saxon migration was due in large part to the strategic foresight and ability to unite diverse groups under the leadership of their chieftains. The Anglo-Saxon migration was a complex process driven by the internal pressures of the tribes, the vulnerabilities left by the Roman withdrawal, and the strong leadership of key tribal figures. These early settlers were not simply raiders, but organized groups seeking new land and opportunities, and they laid the foundation for the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms that would shape the course of British history. Through their military prowess, cultural adaptation, and strategic leadership, the Anglo-Saxons became a dominant force in Britain, paving the way for the unified England that would emerge centuries later. The formation of early Anglo-Saxon kingdoms was not a simple or immediate process. It was the result of a gradual settlement of tribal groups and their interaction with the Romanized culture of Britain. Initially, the Anglo-Saxon tribes, the Saxons, Angles, and Jutes, formed small coastal settlements, primarily in the southeast. These early settlements were marked by wooden huts, tribal leaders, and a loose organization centered around the warrior elite.
However, as the Anglo-Saxons began to settle in Britain, their tribal system started evolving. What began as loosely organized tribal units slowly transformed into stronger, more defined kingdoms, driven by both military conquest and social needs. The early Anglo-Saxon kingdoms, like Kent, Wessex, and Sussex, were initially independent, often governed by chieftains or kings who held their power through a combination of personal charisma, kinship ties, and military strength. The interaction between these kingdoms was often marked by competition and alliances. While the kingdoms of Wessex and Mercia were frequently at odds, seeking dominance over the southern and midland territories of Britain, their conflicts also gave rise to moments of cooperation, especially against Viking invaders. The Kingdom of Wessex, under Alfred the Great, eventually established dominance in the 9th century, but this process was not immediate. There were periods of shifting power, with kingdoms forming, collapsing, or merging, such as the rise and fall of Northumbria and Mercia. Politically, the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms gradually shifted from a more tribal-based governance to a feudal system as they grew in size and complexity. Over time, as the kingdoms solidified their territorial control, centralized kingship began to take shape, especially under the reign of Alfred the Great and his successors. These monarchs introduced law codes, taxation systems, and military structures that helped maintain order and foster growth. These kingdoms didn't grow in isolation, however. They were part of a larger Germanic world that included other Germanic tribes and kingdoms. Trade, cultural exchange, and diplomatic relations allowed the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms to interact with neighboring kingdoms and nations, including the Franks, Frisians, and the Vikings, who would later play a major role in their downfall and eventual unification.
The relationship between the Anglo-Saxon leaders and the native Celtic Britons was a complicated mix of conflict, assimilation, and cooperation. Early on, the Anglo-Saxons encountered the remnants of the Romanized Celtic Britons who had lived under Roman rule for centuries. These Britons were not entirely unprepared for the Anglo-Saxon arrival. They had long been accustomed to defending their territory against external threats, but they were now facing a new wave of invaders. The initial conflict between the Anglo-Saxons and the Celtic Britons was inevitable. The Anglo-Saxons, as they began to settle, sought to expand their territory at the expense of the Celtic kingdoms. Pictish raids, Celtic resistance, and the general fear of invasion led to hostile encounters. The native Britons, especially those in the west, such as in Wales and Cornwall, resisted the growing Anglo-Saxon dominance. In some regions, however, there were moments of cooperation, such as alliances forged between Anglo-Saxon kings and local Celtic rulers to defend against common threats like the Vikings or the incursions of other Germanic tribes. In the southeast, where the Anglo-Saxons first settled, the relationship was more fluid. Anglo-Saxon rulers often married into the local Celtic aristocracy, thus creating alliances and securing peace. Over time, many of the Celtic Britons were either assimilated into Anglo-Saxon society or pushed into more remote regions of Britain. The Celtic culture began to fade from the southern and eastern parts of Britain, while Welsh, Cornish, and Scottish cultures remained more distinct in the west and north.
The language and religion of the native Britons also began to disappear in many areas, as the Anglo-Saxons adopted Christianity and Old English as the dominant ways of life. Yet remnants of Celtic influence remained, especially in the place names, local legends, and cultural traditions that were carried over, particularly in the north and west. The Anglo-Saxons' adaptation to their new land was a tale of resourcefulness and innovation, deeply shaped by their need to thrive in a foreign and often hostile environment. Initially, the Anglo-Saxons faced challenges in mastering the landscape of Britain. Unlike their homelands, the fertile lowlands and mountainous regions of Britain required new strategies for agriculture and military defense. Agriculturally, the Anglo-Saxons introduced advanced techniques that transformed the British countryside. They brought with them new methods of plowing, crop rotation, and livestock management that vastly improved farming yields. The cultivation of barley, wheat, and oats became central to their economy. This allowed the Anglo-Saxon settlements to thrive in what had once been agriculturally underdeveloped regions. By turning Britain's fertile lands into productive agricultural zones, they secured a strong economic base. Military adaptation was equally crucial to their success. The Anglo-Saxons, skilled in warfare, used their knowledge of raiding and fortification to protect their new settlements. They constructed burhs, fortified towns that were strategically placed throughout the kingdom. These fortifications were not just defensive, they were also hubs of commerce, administration, and social cohesion. In addition to their defensive capabilities, the Anglo-Saxon military system relied on infantry and archers, as well as the use of naval fleets that could strike across Britain's coastlines. In terms of governance, the Anglo-Saxons integrated their tribal traditions with the administrative needs of a growing society. They established a system of local rule through lords, earls, and chieftains, who governed specific regions, ensuring the spread of Anglo-Saxon law and order. Kings like Alfred the Great introduced reforms that strengthened the central monarchy and created a more cohesive society. His legal codes and military strategies helped transform the Anglo-Saxons from a group of tribal societies into a more centralized kingdom with a stronger sense of national identity. The early Anglo-Saxon kingdoms were built on a foundation of resilience, adaptation, and innovation. From their agricultural practices to their military systems and governance, the Anglo-Saxons succeeded in transforming Britain into a land that would eventually be unified under their rule. The process was not without conflict, but it was also marked by integration, alliances, and the slow but steady merging of Celtic and Germanic traditions. Over time, the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms would play a pivotal role in shaping the England that we know today.
The formation of early Anglo-Saxon kingdoms was not a simple or immediate process. It was the result of a gradual settlement of tribal groups and their interaction with the Romanized culture of Britain. Initially, the Anglo-Saxon tribes, the Saxons, Angles, and Jutes, formed small coastal settlements, primarily in the southeast. These early settlements were marked by wooden huts, tribal leaders, and a loose organization centered around the warrior elite. However, as the Anglo-Saxons began to settle in Britain, their tribal system started evolving. What began as loosely organized tribal units slowly transformed into stronger, more defined kingdoms, driven by both military conquest and social needs. The early Anglo-Saxon kingdoms, like Kent, Wessex, and Sussex, were initially independent, often governed by chieftains or kings who held their power through a combination of personal charisma, kinship ties, and military strength. The interaction between these kingdoms was often marked by competition and alliances. While the kingdoms of Wessex and Mercia were frequently at odds, seeking dominance over the southern and midland territories of Britain, their conflicts also gave rise to moments of cooperation, especially against Viking invaders. The Kingdom of Wessex, under Alfred the Great, eventually established dominance in the 9th century, but this process was not immediate. There were periods of shifting power, with kingdoms forming, collapsing, or merging, such as the rise and fall of Northumbria and Mercia. Politically, the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms gradually shifted from a more tribal-based governance to a feudal system as they grew in size and complexity. Over time, as the kingdoms solidified their territorial control, centralized kingship began to take shape, especially under the reign of Alfred the Great and his successors. These monarchs introduced law codes, taxation systems, and military structures that helped maintain order and foster growth.
These kingdoms didn't grow in isolation, however. They were part of a larger Germanic world that included other Germanic tribes and kingdoms. Trade, cultural exchange, and diplomatic relations allowed the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms to interact with neighboring kingdoms and nations, including the Franks, Frisians, and the Vikings, who would later play a major role in their downfall and eventual unification. The relationship between the Anglo-Saxon leaders and the native Celtic Britons was a complicated mix of conflict, assimilation, and cooperation. Early on, the Anglo-Saxons encountered the remnants of the Romanized Celtic Britons, who had lived under Roman rule for centuries. These Britons were not entirely unprepared for the Anglo-Saxon arrival. They had long been accustomed to defending their territory against external threats, but they were now facing a new wave of invaders. The initial conflict between the Anglo-Saxons and the Celtic Britons was inevitable. The Anglo-Saxons, as they began to settle, sought to expand their territory at the expense of the Celtic kingdoms. Pictish raids, Celtic resistance, and the general fear of invasion led to hostile encounters. The native Britons, especially those in the west, such as in Wales and Cornwall, resisted the growing Anglo-Saxon dominance. In some regions, however, there were moments of cooperation, such as alliances forged between Anglo-Saxon kings and local Celtic rulers to defend against common threats like the Vikings or the incursions of other Germanic tribes. In the southeast, where the Anglo-Saxons first settled, the relationship was more fluid. Anglo-Saxon rulers often married into the local Celtic aristocracy, thus creating alliances and securing peace. Over time, many of the Celtic Britons were either assimilated into Anglo-Saxon society or pushed into more remote regions of Britain. The Celtic culture began to fade from the southern and eastern parts of Britain, while Welsh, Cornish, and Scottish cultures remained more distinct in the west and north.
Agriculturally, the Anglo-Saxons introduced advanced techniques that transformed the British countryside. They brought with them new methods of plowing, crop rotation, and livestock management that vastly improved farming yields. The cultivation of barley, wheat, and oats became central to their economy. This allowed the Anglo-Saxon settlements to thrive in what had once been agriculturally underdeveloped regions. By turning Britain's fertile lands into productive agricultural zones, they secured a strong economic base. Military adaptation was equally crucial to their success. The Anglo-Saxons, skilled in warfare, used their knowledge of raiding and fortification to protect their new settlements. They constructed burhs, fortified towns that were strategically placed throughout the kingdom. These fortifications were not just defensive, they were also hubs of commerce, administration, and social cohesion. In addition to their defensive capabilities, the Anglo-Saxon military system relied on infantry and archers, as well as the use of naval fleets that could strike across Britain's coastlines.
In terms of governance, the Anglo-Saxons integrated their tribal traditions with the administrative needs of a growing society. They established a system of local rule through lords, earls, and chieftains who governed specific regions, ensuring the spread of Anglo-Saxon law and order. Kings like Alfred the Great introduced reforms that strengthened the central monarchy and created a more cohesive society. His legal codes and military strategies helped transform the Anglo-Saxons from a group of tribal societies into a more centralized kingdom with a stronger sense of national identity.
The early Anglo-Saxon kingdoms were built on a foundation of resilience, adaptation, and innovation. From their agricultural practices to their military systems and governance, the Anglo-Saxons succeeded in transforming Britain into a land that would eventually be unified under their rule. The process was not without conflict, but it was also marked by integration, alliances, and the slow but steady merging of Celtic and Germanic traditions. Over time, the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms would play a pivotal role in shaping the England that we know today. Ethelbert of Kent holds an exceptional place in English history as the first Anglo-Saxon king to convert to Christianity, marking the beginning of a religious and political transformation that would reverberate throughout the British Isles for centuries. His conversion, however, was not merely a personal spiritual choice. It was a political maneuver that helped secure his kingdom's place within the broader European framework, which was increasingly dominated by Christian rulers. In 597 AD, the arrival of St. Augustine of Canterbury on a mission from Pope Gregory I was the catalyst for Ethelbert's conversion. His wife, Bertha, a Christian Frankish princess, had already been instrumental in introducing him to the faith. Ethelbert's conversion to Christianity wasn't just symbolic. It had profound implications for his kingdom and its relationship with the Roman Church. As the first Anglo-Saxon king to embrace Christianity, he sought to align Kent with the larger Christianized world, particularly with the powerful Roman papacy. This move provided Ethelbert with diplomatic leverage, as the Church offered protection and legitimacy in return for support of Christian missionary work.
This alliance with the Roman Church also allowed Ethelbert to secure political advantages within Christian Europe. Kent, being situated close to the Franks and having direct connections to Christian networks, was strategically important in terms of trade and diplomacy. By converting, Ethelbert not only strengthened Kent's economic ties with Christian realms on the continent, but also enhanced his political status, particularly among Christian kingdoms like the Franks, with whom he had marriages and alliances. Religiously, Ethelbert's conversion helped to stabilize his rule by integrating the church into the governance of his kingdom. The church's influence grew rapidly, with monasteries becoming centers of education, law, and trade, helping to structure society along Christian lines. However, it was not without challenges. Ethelbert's conversion and the Christianization of his court was met with resistance from some factions within his own court, who were deeply entrenched in pagan traditions. The cultural clash between paganism and the newly emerging Christianity became a defining feature of the Anglo-Saxon period, one that would play a central role in shaping England's religious landscape. Alfred the Great's rise to power is nothing short of extraordinary. Defined by the early adversity he faced, the military challenges he overcame, and the visionary leadership that ultimately shaped the future of Wessex and all of Anglo-Saxon England. Born into a royal family, Alfred's early life was one of relative privilege, but his rise to the throne was by no means inevitable. He was the youngest of 5 sons, and his path to the throne was shaped by the deaths of his older brothers, each of whom fell in battle against the Vikings or died of illness. When Alfred became king in 871 AD, Wessex was in a state of crisis. The Viking Great Heathen Army, a powerful and organized force, had already ravaged much of East Anglia and was threatening Wessex itself. Alfred's early years were marked by continual warfare and the fear of Viking conquest.
The battle that defined Alfred's early rule was the Battle of Edington in 878, after Alfred had retreated to the marshes of Athelney. What makes Alfred's leadership truly remarkable was his ability to turn what could have been a disastrous retreat into a strategic victory. From his time in the marshes, he not only recruited and trained an army, but also restructured Wessex's defenses, building a network of burhs,
which are fortified towns, to protect his kingdom from Viking raids. These burhs became the foundation for a more centralized and organized defense system, one that was crucial in the long war against the Vikings. Alfred's leadership was not limited to military endeavors. He also revived learning and the church, recognizing that education and Christianity were key to the cultural and intellectual development of his people. He established schools, promoted the translation of Latin texts into Old English, and sought to unite his kingdom under a common law. His reign is also marked by efforts to integrate Viking settlers into the kingdom, a policy that would have long-term effects on the Anglo-Saxon-Viking relations. Alfred's vision for Wessex went beyond simply defeating the Vikings. He laid the groundwork for England's unification and the creation of a more centralized government. Edward the Elder, the son of Alfred the Great, inherited a kingdom that was under constant threat from the Vikings and fractured by internal political tensions. After Alfred's death in 899, Edward faced immense challenges in consolidating power over a kingdom that was still under siege. His reign was marked by military conflict, internal divisions, and the need for strategic diplomacy to unite the Anglo-Saxon realm. One of Edward's first major challenges was to consolidate control over the southern kingdom of Wessex, especially after rival claimants to the throne contested his rule. Despite these initial political challenges, Edward demonstrated military acumen by successfully fending off Viking incursions and expanding Wessex's borders. Edward launched a series of military campaigns against the Danish Vikings, who controlled much of East Anglia and Mercia. These campaigns ultimately helped secure Wessex's dominance over the southern and central parts of England.
What truly distinguished Edward was his ability to unite the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms under one banner. Though he did not achieve total unification during his lifetime, he laid the groundwork for the eventual unification of England by his son, Athelstan. Edward's use of fortified towns, burhs, to protect his kingdom from Viking raids and rebellion proved highly effective, and his ability to integrate Viking settlers into Wessex society helped to solidify his rule. Athelstan, the first king to style himself King of all England, represents the culmination of centuries of Anglo-Saxon military and political evolution. Following in the footsteps of his father, Edward the Elder, Athelstan faced the monumental task of unifying the divided Anglo-Saxon kingdoms and subjugating Viking-held territories in the north. Athelstan's reign was defined by his victory at the Battle of Brunanburh in 937, where he decisively defeated a coalition of Viking forces led by Olaf Gudfrithson of Dublin and Constantine II of Scotland. This victory effectively shattered the power of the Vikings in northern England and secured Athelstan's position as the unifying king of all Anglo-Saxons. It also established his reputation as a military genius who could forge alliances and build a coalition strong enough to defeat external threats. Athelstan was also a diplomatic master, forging alliances with continental European rulers, such as the Franks, and using these alliances to strengthen his rule. His success in marriage diplomacy, especially his alliances with Scotland and Wales, further strengthened his rule. Athelstan's efforts at unification were not solely through military conquest, but through building a cohesive political structure that allowed for more centralized governance.
The key Anglo-Saxon monarchs, Athelbert of Kent, Alfred the Great, Edward the Elder, and Athelstan, each played a vital role in the development of Anglo-Saxon England. Their leadership, marked by military triumphs, strategic alliances, and political reforms, helped lay the foundation for a unified England. From the Christianization of Athelbert's kingdom to the military consolidation under Athelstan, these rulers transformed Anglo-Saxon society and laid the groundwork for the rise of a unified English state. The formation of the Danelaw represents one of the most significant chapters in the history of Viking invasions and the Anglo-Saxon struggle for survival. Following a series of relentless raids and invasions throughout the 9th century, the Vikings, largely from Denmark and Norway, began to carve out territories in England. The term Danelaw refers to the areas of England that were under Viking control, particularly after the Treaty of Wedmore in 878 AD, which established a temporary peace between the Viking leader Guthrum and Alfred the Great of Wessex. The Danelaw was not a single kingdom or unified entity, but a collection of Viking-controlled territories that stretched across much of northern and eastern England, including key areas like Northumbria, East Anglia, Mercia, and parts of Essex. The area roughly encompassed the modern-day regions of Yorkshire, Lincolnshire, Cambridgeshire, and Norfolk, as well as parts of the Midlands. Within these regions, Viking settlers began to establish their own governance and society, often blending their Norse customs with the existing Anglo-Saxon structures. The primary influence of the Danelaw lay in its military and political power. Vikings established strongholds in major cities such as York, which became a Viking capital, Nottingham, and Derby, allowing them to control trade routes and exert power over the surrounding Anglo-Saxon territories. Their control led to significant changes in the economic structures, particularly with the influx of Norse merchants and their crafts. The Danelaw was marked by its distinctive cultural influence in law, language, and military organization.
This Viking settlement also represented a geopolitical division in England, as Wessex and its southern Anglo-Saxon territories, under Alfred the Great, remained independent and relatively untouched by Viking rule. The creation of the Danelaw effectively split England in two, a Viking-dominated north and east and a Wessex-dominated south. This division would continue to affect the kingdom's political landscape for years to come, until the eventual unification of England. The Viking settlement in the Danelaw had profound cultural and political consequences for both the Anglo-Saxons and the Vikings. The Anglo-Saxon rulers, particularly Alfred the Great of Wessex, faced enormous pressure in the aftermath of these invasions, which led to a series of political negotiations and military responses. One of the most notable consequences of Viking settlement was the introduction of Norse culture into the Anglo-Saxon world. The Vikings brought with them a distinctive social system, including a form of tribal law and leadership that was rooted in their warrior society. In contrast to the Anglo-Saxon hierarchy, which relied on kingship and noble families with lands and titles, the Vikings often practiced a more egalitarian system of chieftainship. The Anglo-Saxon rulers of Wessex, particularly Alfred the Great, had to find a balance between military defense and diplomatic negotiation. After the Viking invasions had laid waste to much of southern and eastern England, Alfred initially fought hard to repel the invaders. However, as the Vikings began to settle, negotiations became necessary. The Treaty of Wedmore, concluded in 878 AD, was one of the most important compromises. It was a peace agreement between Alfred and Guthrum, the Viking leader, which marked the end of the immediate Viking threat to Wessex. In exchange for peace, Guthrum and his followers were allowed to settle in the Danelaw in exchange for swearing allegiance to Christianity and agreeing to respect the sovereignty of Alfred's kingdom in the south. This was a significant compromise for both sides. The Vikings were granted land in exchange for their conversion to Christianity, while Alfred solidified his control over Wessex and preserved its independence.
While Alfred's military success in defeating the Vikings at Edington was pivotal, these political compromises, like the establishment of the Danelaw, were crucial to the Anglo-Saxon survival. The agreements made between Alfred and the Viking leaders also marked the beginning of a long-standing Anglo-Saxon-Viking coexistence, as both sides moved toward negotiation and cooperation in an attempt to secure peace and stability. These early political deals set the precedent for future rulers of Wessex, who would continue to negotiate with Viking leaders to preserve their kingdom's interests. The Danelaw's cultural influence on the Anglo-Saxons was profound and far-reaching. The Viking settlers brought their own language, laws, and customs, which were absorbed into the local culture. Over time, the Danelaw became a melting pot of Anglo-Saxon and Norse traditions, with lasting impacts on language, law, and commerce. 1. Language. One of the most enduring impacts of Viking settlement in the Danelaw was the influence of the Old Norse language on Old English. Over centuries, Norse words began to infiltrate the Anglo-Saxon lexicon, particularly in the north and east of England. Words related to commerce, law, and even everyday life were borrowed from Old Norse. And many place names in the Danelaw, such as York, Derby, and Grimsby, still bear traces of their Viking heritage. Norse vocabulary also influenced the way Anglo-Saxons structured their sentences and expressed themselves, which contributed to the eventual development of Middle English. 2. Laws. The Vikings also brought with them a distinct legal system that was based on tribal customs. Unlike the more feudal and centralized laws of the Anglo-Saxons, Viking laws were more decentralized and placed heavy emphasis on the community. This system relied on local assemblies, known as thing, where disputes were settled through trial by jury and oaths. These legal practices were eventually absorbed into Anglo-Saxon society, leading to the development of a more hybrid legal framework in the regions governed by the Danelaw. Elements of the Norse judicial system remained significant in areas like Yorkshire, and community-based law continued to influence the way legal proceedings were handled in medieval England.
3. Commerce. The Viking settlers were not only warriors but also skilled traders and craftsmen, and their influence on commerce in the Danelaw was substantial. The Vikings established trade networks that spanned from the Baltic to the Mediterranean, and their settlements in the Danelaw facilitated the growth of local markets and trade routes. Cities like York became thriving centers of commerce where Anglo-Saxon and Viking merchants exchanged goods such as wool, salt, iron, and wine. The Viking influx of wealth and new commercial connections helped to revitalize parts of England that had previously been isolated from broader European trade networks. The Viking presence also introduced new craftsmanship techniques, including those used in shipbuilding, metalworking, and textile production. This helped the Danelaw regions become known for their high-quality artifacts and tools, which were traded throughout Britain and Europe. In summary, the Danelaw was a transformative period for Anglo-Saxon England, as it reshaped the country in ways that would influence its development for centuries. The Viking influence on language, law, and commerce brought a new vitality and complexity to the Anglo-Saxon world, creating a cultural hybridization that would later become the foundation for modern English society. The Danelaw was not just a military occupation by the Vikings, it was a period of profound cultural exchange that left a lasting impact on Anglo-Saxon England. Through political negotiation, linguistic exchange, and cultural fusion, the Vikings helped shape the language, laws, and trade systems of the regions they controlled. The Anglo-Saxons and Vikings, once fierce enemies, found ways to coexist, transforming England into a dynamic society that would evolve into the medieval kingdom we know today. The legacy of the Danelaw is still visible in place names, legal traditions, and cultural practices that have endured for over a millennium.
In the Anglo-Saxon social system, the thanes were an elite class, standing just below the king and the highest nobility, but still holding significant power over the land and the people. The thanes were typically military leaders who served the king or a local lord in exchange for land grants. In essence, they were the feudal lords of their time, exercising authority over large estates and maintaining a small army of warriors that would be called upon during times of conflict. Their role in military service was crucial. The thanes were the ones who defended their territories against both internal and external threats, and they were expected to support the king's campaigns when necessary. Beyond their military duty, the thanes were deeply involved in the administration of their lands. They oversaw agriculture, taxation, and justice within their localities, and they were also responsible for dispensing law in their courts.
This made the Thanes the backbone of Anglo-Saxon governance, wielding both economic and political power. The social status of the Thanes was firmly tied to land ownership. Their position in society was bolstered by their access to land, and it was through this ownership that they cemented their influence. As the wealthiest landowners, they were in a privileged position to secure political alliances with other Thanes and royal figures. However, the Thane's status was not absolute. It depended on their loyalty to the king, and if they fell out of favor or failed in their military duties, they could lose their land and their position.
In many ways, the Thanes' political significance stretched beyond their military roles. They were often involved in court politics and royal council, advising the king on matters ranging from taxation to law codes. Their influence reached into the church, where they were also key patrons of monasteries and church lands, helping to weave Christianity into the social fabric of Anglo-Saxon life. At the heart of Anglo-Saxon England's agrarian economy were the ceorls, or free peasants, who were the primary labor force that sustained the kingdom's agriculture and economy. While they were free men in the sense that they were not slaves, they did not hold the same level of power or wealth as the Thanes. Ceorls were often small-scale farmers who owned their own land, but their holdings were typically modest compared to those of the Thanes. The ceorls' rights were tied to their land tenure. They had the right to farm their land and pass it down to their heirs, but they were also obligated to their lords, the Thanes, to whom they owed both military service and taxation. This dual obligation placed the ceorls in an intermediate status between the landless and the elite. They were vital to the feudal system, as their work provided the food that sustained the upper classes. The ceorls played a significant role in local governance. While they were not part of the noble class, they could participate in local councils and even sometimes serve as judges in local courts. These responsibilities, however, were still tied to their relationship with the thane or lord, whose authority ultimately governed their lives. The ceorls' rights were also tempered by their duties. They had to pay rent and provide military service in times of war. This obligated the ceorls to their lord's cause, but also granted them certain protections and a stake in the local community.
While their social mobility was limited, a ceorl could achieve higher status if they amassed enough wealth or land, perhaps through inheritance or a successful marriage. However, the ceorls' power remained fragile, as they were always one step away from losing their land if they failed to meet their obligations to their lords. At the bottom of the social hierarchy were the thralls, the slaves of Anglo-Saxon England. These individuals were often captured in wars, raids, or were born into servitude. The thralls had little to no rights and were considered the property of their masters. Unlike the ceorls, the thralls had no autonomy and were entirely dependent on their masters for sustenance and shelter. The living conditions for thralls were generally harsh. They were given little freedom and worked long hours, often performing the hardest, most degrading tasks on the farms, in the homes of their masters, or in craft workshops. Thralls could be bought and sold, and their status as property was absolute. The work they performed included everything from agricultural labor to domestic chores to construction work. They had no ability to accumulate wealth or status, and their lives were often a continuous cycle of labor without the possibility of improvement. Yet, despite their grim circumstances, the thralls were indispensable to the economy. The Anglo-Saxon economy was largely agrarian, and the thralls provided the cheap labor that was necessary to maintain agricultural production. Without their labor, the noble classes and thanes could not have sustained the level of wealth and power they enjoyed. Additionally, thralls also played important roles in the manufacturing of goods such as weapons, tools, and clothing, which contributed to the growth of trade in Anglo-Saxon England.
While life for the thralls was harsh, there were instances where some could eventually earn freedom or be granted their manumission by their masters. This was rare, but it demonstrated that the structure of servitude in Anglo-Saxon England was not entirely fixed. The possibility of freedom, though slim, added a layer of complexity to the institution of slavery and its integration into the broader society. In Anglo-Saxon England, land ownership was the cornerstone of both political power and social status. Land was not merely an economic resource, it was the foundation upon which one's status in society was built. Those who controlled the land were able to exercise power and dictate the structure of the kingdom, from military strategy to the economic system. The king and noble families owned vast estates, and landholding was a sign of authority. These nobles, the thanes, were granted land by the king in return for military service. The size of a thane's landholdings often determined their political influence, as the more land they controlled, the more warriors they could muster, and the more taxes they could collect. The ability to distribute land was a way for the king to reward loyalty and consolidate power, and land grants were essential for maintaining control over a kingdom. For the churls, owning land represented social mobility. While their landholdings were small, churls could increase their social standing by acquiring more land or becoming more prosperous. Land inheritance played a crucial role in this, as free peasants who inherited land were able to pass it down to future generations, securing their family's place within the social order. Conversely, losing land could lead to a fall in social status, particularly for the churls, who were heavily dependent on their land for both economic survival and personal autonomy.
For thralls, land ownership was unattainable, as they were bound to the service of others. Thralls had no legal claim to land and were instead treated as property, working the land on behalf of their masters. Their lack of land ownership reinforced their subjugated position within Anglo-Saxon society. Land was not merely a commodity in Anglo-Saxon England, it was the foundation of the social hierarchy. From the thanes at the top, who controlled vast estates, to the churls whose land ownership provided them with a degree of social mobility, to the thralls, whose labor sustained the economy, the system of landholding defined not just the economic, but the political and social structure of the time. These interlocking relationships between kings, nobles, peasants, and slaves helped shape the social fabric of Anglo-Saxon England, with land ownership being the central pillar that supported the kingdom's stability and growth. The role of women in Anglo-Saxon society was primarily centered around family life, but it was also deeply intertwined with land ownership, inheritance, and the complex web of social relations that formed the fabric of this early medieval society. In the Anglo-Saxon world, marriage was more than a union of two individuals, it was an economic and political alliance. For women, marriage meant a shift in social status and a direct connection to the land controlled by their husbands. However, while marriage defined women's roles in many ways, it also provided a degree of agency. Women could inherit land through their families, and some even maintained rights over property after marriage. Women were not passive within the system, but actively participated in the management of the household and land.
When a woman's husband passed away, the inheritance rights of widows were key to the continuity of the family estate. A widow's right to inherit land was enshrined in law and was often accompanied by the responsibility of managing the estate until her children were of age or until she remarried. Women could own land in their own right, although this was more common among the noble and wealthy classes. However, it is crucial to note that the system of land inheritance was typically patriarchal. If a woman remarried, her new husband often gained control of her land, and daughters had fewer rights to inheritance than sons. Through marriage, women gained access to wealth, social standing, and family alliances. However, the control of land and the management of the household economy were key responsibilities for women, and they ensured that the estates functioned efficiently. While marriage in Anglo-Saxon England might have been a system that limited a woman's autonomy, some women managed to rise to positions of political and military influence that transcended their gender roles. One of the most striking examples of this is Queen Athelflaed, the daughter of Alfred the Great. Athelflaed's remarkable political and military achievements demonstrate the strength of women in Anglo-Saxon leadership. When her husband, Elfhelm, died in 911, Athelflaed assumed leadership of Mercia, a kingdom crucial in the fight against the Vikings. Athelflaed was not merely a figurehead, she led military campaigns, successfully expelling Viking forces from Derby, Nottingham, and other Viking-held territories. In addition to her military leadership, Athelflaed oversaw the construction of fortified towns, burhs, which would become a cornerstone of the Anglo-Saxon defensive strategy against the Vikings. Her reign was not only defined by military victories, but also by her political acumen. Athelflaed negotiated alliances, brokered peace, and was an influential figure in the court of her father, Alfred, and her brother, Edward the Elder. Her leadership was a significant departure from traditional gender expectations, and it demonstrated the growing role of women in shaping political and military outcomes. Athelflaed's ability to command armies and lead her kingdom placed her among the most influential women in Anglo-Saxon England. Her legacy is a testament to the agency women could wield even within the limitations of a patriarchal society. The rise of Christianity in Anglo-Saxon England, particularly after the mission of St. Augustine in the late 6th century, had profound effects on the role of women. Christianity redefined women's roles in many ways, creating new avenues for influence and leadership that were unavailable in pre-Christian societies. One of the most notable shifts was the rise of Christian women in monastic life. Christian monasticism offered women a spiritual path that allowed them to gain influence and autonomy outside of the domestic sphere. Nuns, often coming from noble families, played key roles in religious communities, which were centers of learning, faith, and economic power. Women could now act as abbesses, the heads of monasteries, who held significant spiritual authority and control over lands and resources.
Hilda of Whitby, one of the most prominent abbesses of the time, was not only a spiritual leader, but also a key political figure. Hilda's monastery at Whitby became a center of learning and religion, and she was an advisor to kings, including King Oswu of Northumbria. Hilda's role as an abbess illustrates how women could wield both religious and political power, a position unimaginable in most other aspects of Anglo-Saxon society. Furthermore, Christianity also elevated the status of women in church communities. The religious reforms ushered in by Christianity, such as monasticism, learning, and charitable acts, allowed women to serve in meaningful ways. Women were involved in the spread of Christianity, both as missionaries and teachers, and they could now participate more fully in the spiritual and intellectual life of the kingdom. This marks a distinct departure from the purely domestic roles that women were expected to play in the pre-Christian era. In conclusion, Christianity in Anglo-Saxon England significantly expanded the opportunities for women to serve as leaders in religious life and broadened the scope of their social influence. The creation of nunneries, monasteries, and the rise of female abbesses were pivotal in reshaping women's status, giving them the means to exert power within a society that otherwise marginalized their roles.
The Anglo-Saxon legal system was remarkably innovative for its time, drawing on both Germanic tribal traditions and the emerging influence of Christianity. The laws of Alfred the Great, the Doom Book,
were among the most comprehensive legal codes of the period. Unlike Roman law, which focused heavily on written legal texts, Alfred's laws were deeply embedded in local customs, yet reformulated to align with Christian ideals of moral justice and community welfare. For instance, Alfred's laws addressed issues such as theft, violence, and adultery, but also emphasized restitution over retribution. His legal code focused on the importance of righting wrongs through financial compensation rather than through the taking of life. The system of wergild, or man price, was central to this, setting a monetary value for crimes committed against a person, depending on their status in society. King Ian of Wessex, who ruled earlier in the 7th century, also contributed significantly to Anglo-Saxon law. His law code, known as Ian's Laws, covered a wide array of social issues, from the rights of women and children to the responsibilities of lords and subjects. Ian's Laws were some of the first to codify property rights and the concept of inheritance, ensuring a sense of order and stability within both noble families and common communities. Through the efforts of these kings, Anglo-Saxon England moved towards a more centralized system of justice, where the king acted not just as a military leader, but as a provider of justice to all his people. This marked a shift towards a more structured and formal legal system, one that would continue to evolve throughout the medieval period. The Anglo-Saxon judicial system was heavily dependent on oral traditions, a feature that makes it stand out from modern written legal systems. Criminal cases were handled in public, open-air courts, typically held in local communities. These proceedings were usually overseen by the local thane or elders, but the community itself played an active role in the trial process. Witnesses were critical in Anglo-Saxon trials, as the testimony of those who had seen or heard about a crime could make or break a case. Given the lack of written records, oral testimony was often the only form of evidence available. The honesty of witnesses was paramount, and to ensure truthfulness, the oath played an essential role in the legal process. People who swore oaths of innocence, in the form of compurgation, were required to bring a set of oath helpers who would testify on their behalf, essentially vouching for the credibility of the oath.
In many ways, oaths in Anglo-Saxon England functioned like a social contract, where the swearing of an oath was understood as invoking divine protection for the truth of the statement. If someone swore falsely, they risked divine punishment, which was considered far more severe than a mere human penalty. The jury system also existed in a rudimentary form during this period. While jurors were not professional judges, they were local men who had knowledge of the community and the parties involved. Their role was to determine the facts of the case and offer a verdict based on social customs and justice. One of the most distinctive aspects of Anglo-Saxon law was the concept of wergild, a system designed to maintain peace by offering a monetary compensation to the victim's family in place of retribution. The word wergild roughly translates to man price, and it was a system that sought to prevent blood feuds by providing a legal and financial alternative to violence. Under the wergild system, every person's life had a value, and that value varied depending on their social status. For instance, the wergild of a king was astronomically high compared to that of a common farmer. This structured approach to restitution ensured that a family who had lost a member could receive compensation that would help to alleviate the economic strain caused by the loss, and it also provided a way to satisfy the honor of the victim's family without violence. Wergild had broader societal benefits. By encouraging monetary compensation rather than retribution, it worked to prevent escalation of violence and intergenerational feuds. Vengeance killings, which could spiral out of control, were now subject to a legal process, and the wergild payment was seen as a way to restore order to a society often caught in the cycle of blood feuds.
The king's role in regulating wergild payments was critical. He ensured that the system was fair and that justice was not only administered but also balanced by the economic realities of the time. While Wergild was not a perfect solution to all conflicts, it was a foundational element in an increasingly complex and stratified society, where military conflict was common but order had to be maintained. The Anglo-Saxon legal system was a complex and evolving structure, rooted in customary law but shaped by the growing influence of Christianity and centralized kingship. Alfred the Great and King Ine laid the foundations for a more formalized and written legal system, creating a framework that addressed everything from land ownership and inheritance to criminal justice. Their laws reflected a deep concern for justice, but also for peace, something embodied in the system of Wergild, which sought to mitigate the violence that could erupt from personal injury and loss. The Anglo-Saxon legal system was, at its heart, a community-based process that relied on witnesses, oaths, and local juries to maintain order. By incorporating these principles, the Anglo-Saxons created a society where legal restitution was preferred over violent retaliation, setting the stage for the common law traditions that would shape England for centuries to come.
The pre-Christian Anglo-Saxon religion was not a static belief system. It was fluid, evolving over centuries, influenced by both ancestral traditions and the cultural exchange with other peoples, particularly the Romans and later Christian missionaries. It was a pagan faith rooted in animism, where gods were seen to reside in every natural force, whether that was the earth, sky, or waters. These beliefs shaped their understanding of the cosmos, their daily lives, and the way they interacted with the world around them. The gods that the Anglo-Saxons worshipped were more than mere abstractions. They were forces of nature, war, justice, and prosperity, each one representing a vital aspect of life in early medieval England. The most prominent deities were Woden, Thunor, or Thor, Tiw, or Ty, and Frigg. But the Anglo-Saxons also venerated a host of lesser gods associated with the home, agriculture, fertility, and warfare. Understanding the deities and the rituals that accompanied them provides insight into a society that viewed the natural world as charged with divine power. At the center of the Anglo-Saxon pantheon stood Woden. Woden was a god of war, wisdom, and death, whose domain extended to both the living and the dead. Woden was seen as the ultimate warrior, the god of kings, and was associated with the fate of warriors, particularly in battle. Warriors and kings alike invoked his name before heading into combat, believing that Woden would provide them with victory or a glorious death. Woden's role as a god of wisdom also positioned him as the god of knowledge and the seeker of mysteries. He was famously depicted as a one-eyed figure, having sacrificed one of his eyes for wisdom at the Well of Wisdom, a symbolic act that tied him to the idea of self-sacrifice for the pursuit of truth. The Viking sagas and Anglo-Saxon poetry, like the Old English poem Beowulf, are infused with this reverence for Woden's powers and his role in shaping fate.
Beside Woden was Thunor, the god of thunder, storms, and protection, widely worshipped for his strength and power. The symbol of the hammer, which became iconic in Norse mythology, was associated with Thunor, who was believed to wield a mighty hammer capable of destroying evil forces. For the Anglo-Saxons, Thunor was the protector of humanity against chaos, often invoked during storms or in times of danger. Tiw, god of law and justice, represented order in a world often on the brink of chaos. As the god of heroic sacrifice, he was invoked in matters of justice and moral decision-making. The idea of law and order in Anglo-Saxon England was not purely secular. It was directly tied to divine oversight, and Tiw was seen as the enforcer of moral laws in both the physical and spiritual worlds. Frigg, Woden's wife, was revered as a goddess of fertility, marriage, and the home. Her domain over the domestic sphere made her a highly significant figure for Anglo-Saxon women. She was not only a mother figure, but also a protector of family ties and relationships, reflecting the importance placed on kinship in Anglo-Saxon culture. The rituals surrounding these deities were integral to Anglo-Saxon religious practice. Sacrifices were made not only to appease the gods, but to ensure the balance of nature. Sacrificial rites varied, but most commonly involved offerings of animals, particularly horses and cattle, as well as food, weapons, and tools. The goal was to show the gods that the people recognized their power and sought their favor. The sacredness of certain natural features, such as groves, rivers, and mountains, further demonstrates the deeply animistic beliefs of the Anglo-Saxons. Stonehenge, though constructed long before the Anglo-Saxons arrived, continued to serve as a ritualistic site where celestial events like the solstice marked a sacred connection between the heavens and the earth. The stone circle was likely used for ceremonies that aligned the people with the changing seasons, asking the gods to bless the crops and provide for the people.
Worship often took place in sacred groves, natural areas considered to be divine territories. These sites were not just for personal devotion, but also for communal rituals and feasts, where individuals would gather to perform sacrificial rites and share in the communal bond forged through the gods' blessings. Beyond the gods themselves, ancestral worship was a key aspect of Anglo-Saxon religious beliefs. Ancestors were believed to watch over their descendants, ensuring their prosperity and protection. The importance of family lineage was paramount in Anglo-Saxon society, and the dead were honored through offerings and rituals intended to keep their spirits pleased. Sacred sites like Stonehenge were part of a larger network of ancestral places, sites where the dead were believed to reside or visit. These locations were not just for worship of the gods, but were integral to maintaining family ties with the ancestors. The connection between these sacred locations and the spiritual realm was clear. The gods were honored and the dead were remembered to maintain cosmic balance. The pre-Christian Anglo-Saxon belief system was deeply rooted in a reverence for nature, ancestors, and a pantheon of gods who governed every aspect of existence. The rituals and sacrifices performed were not simply symbolic acts, but essential components of daily life, ensuring that the divine realm and the mortal world remained in harmony. The sacred sites like Stonehenge served as focal points where humans could connect with the divine, reaffirming the deep relationship the Anglo-Saxons had with their gods and ancestors. The Anglo-Saxon pantheon reflects a society attuned to the forces of nature, where divinity and earthly existence were inseparable, and where ritual and sacrifice ensured both spiritual and social stability. The conversion of Anglo-Saxon England to Christianity was not simply a religious transformation, it was a political, cultural, and social revolution that shaped the very identity of the English people. This transition, which began in earnest around 597 AD with the mission of Saint Augustine, took several generations to unfold. Christianity would gradually replace the old pagan gods, rituals, and social structures, setting the stage for a new England, one that would be deeply influenced by the Roman Church, yet also adapt Christian teachings to its own unique context. The journey to Christianization was marked by the gradual introduction of Christian doctrines, the conversion of kings like Ethelbert of Kent, and the establishment of Christian structures such as churches, monasteries, and cathedrals. Yet this process was anything but smooth. It involved not just the embrace of a new faith, but also the conflict, compromise, and sacrifice inherent in changing centuries-old beliefs. Christianity did not merely replace paganism, it redefined Anglo-Saxon life, from the most sacred rites to the political order. The arrival of Saint Augustine and his band of Christian missionaries in 597 AD marked the official beginning of the Anglo-Saxon conversion to Christianity.
Sent by Pope Gregory I, Augustine's mission was both a religious and political venture, aimed at spreading Christianity to the Anglo-Saxons while also solidifying papal authority in the region. His initial success came with Ethelbert of Kent, the king who ruled over the kingdom that had been a key center of pagan power in southern England. Ethelbert's conversion was pivotal, as it marked the first time a ruling Anglo-Saxon monarch publicly embraced Christianity. Ethelbert, already married to Bertha, a Christian princess from France, was likely more receptive to the new faith, influenced by his wife's beliefs and the growing influence of Christian missionaries in the region. His conversion was significant because it legitimized Christianity in Kent and provided a model for other kingdoms to follow.
This shift had profound political consequences. By aligning himself with the Pope and the Christian Church, Ethelbert elevated his status beyond the local tribal traditions and allied himself with the greater Christian world. The king's support allowed the missionaries to establish churches, with Augustine founding the Church of St. Augustine and making Canterbury the religious heart of England. This was not just a spiritual transformation, but also a political maneuver, ensuring Kent's place in the Christian world and positioning Ethelbert as a leader of religious significance. Over time, Ethelbert's conversion created a domino effect, with other kingdoms, such as Northumbria and Wessex, gradually adopting Christianity. However, this process was neither instantaneous nor universal. Resistance from other kings, particularly those in the North and Midlands, meant that the spread of Christianity often relied on a mixture of diplomacy, marriage alliances, and sometimes military conflict. The introduction of Christianity in Anglo-Saxon England was a political game-changer. Christian kings began to wield not only secular power, but also spiritual authority, which granted them legitimacy both at home and in their relations with neighboring kingdoms. However, the shift was not without conflict. The Anglo-Saxon world was still deeply steeped in pagan beliefs, and the conversion of royalty was often the first step in the wider adoption of Christianity. In kingdoms like Mercia, ruled by the pagan king Penda, resistance was strong. Penda fiercely rejected Christianity and sought to protect pagan traditions, even waging war against Christian kings like Oswald of Northumbria and Edwin of Northumbria, both of whom had embraced the faith. The battles between these Christian kings and pagan rulers were not just military conflicts. They were symbolic struggles between the new Christian order and the ancient pagan traditions that had long shaped Anglo-Saxon identity. Penda's resistance was ultimately crushed, but his efforts show how the Christianization of England was fraught with violence, clashes of culture, and a fierce contest for power.
Even in areas where Christianity was more widely accepted, tensions remained between the old pagan customs and the new Christian teachings. The syncretism that developed was often marked by compromise, where pagan rites, such as seasonal festivals, sacrifices, and sacred groves, were reinterpreted and absorbed into Christian practice. Christian missionaries were adept at incorporating local customs, such as aligning Christian festivals with existing pagan celebrations, to make the new faith more accessible and acceptable to the people. The Christianization of Anglo-Saxon England did not just change the religion of the people, it transformed the entire political and cultural landscape. As Christianity spread, it brought with it the rise of the church as a political power. The creation of church councils, the construction of monasteries as centers of learning and governance, and the establishment of a unified Christian calendar helped standardize not only religious practices, but also the way politics and administration were carried out. Christianity also changed the role of kings. No longer simply tribal leaders, the Christian kings of Anglo-Saxon England began to view themselves as divinely appointed rulers, tasked with ensuring the spiritual and temporal well-being of their people. This shift in identity made kings like Athelberth, Alfred the Great, and Athelstan not just military leaders, but also spiritual protectors of their people.
Their authority was now divinely sanctioned, and the church became a central player in their legitimacy. The legacy of Christianity in Anglo-Saxon England is also evident in the development of Anglo-Saxon culture. The Christian church became the custodian of education, literature, and arts, preserving ancient texts and promoting the creation of new works. Monasteries, once primarily places of worship, became cultural hubs, where the learning of the classical world was revived and Christian scripture was preserved and taught.
The conversion to Christianity in Anglo-Saxon England marked one of the most significant transformations in the history of the British Isles. It was not a simple shift from one religion to another. It was a restructuring of society, where political power, cultural identity, and religious belief were reshaped by the influence of Christianity. Led by figures like St. Augustine, the conversion was both a spiritual and political process, one that created alliances, sparked conflicts, and irrevocably changed the future of England. As Christianity took root, the foundations were laid for the England we know today, shaped by the Church's influence in both the political and cultural spheres. Anglo-Saxon England was a society in transition, where the ancient pagan beliefs of the Germanic tribes met the new Christian faith, and where the Christian church became a powerful institution shaping not just religious life, but the entire cultural, intellectual, and political landscape of early medieval England. At the heart of this transformation were the monasteries, places of worship, learning, and cultural preservation that laid the foundation for a future Christian England. Monasticism was not just a religious practice, it was a force for cultural continuity. The monasteries were the hubs of learning, serving as the primary institutions for the preservation of knowledge from both the pagan and Christian worlds. In a time when much of Europe was facing the disintegration of Roman infrastructure, the Anglo-Saxon monasteries kept the flame of learning alive. They transcribed manuscripts, preserved classical texts, and translated Christian works into Old English, making knowledge accessible to those who could read and ensuring that Christian principles were passed down through generations. Key monastic leaders, like Saint Benedict of Nursia, whose rules for monastic life became the standard in Anglo-Saxon England, organized these monasteries in a way that emphasized education, community service, and self-sufficiency. Benedictine monks, following the Benedictine rule, not only served as spiritual guides, but were also scholars, translators, and educators. Monks like Bede, the great Anglo-Saxon scholar from the monastery of Jarrow, wrote important theological works and contributed significantly to the preservation of knowledge, including the Ecclesiastical History of the English People, which remains a cornerstone of English history. Monasteries were not just about preserving knowledge. They were also the spiritual and cultural heart of Anglo-Saxon England. These monastic communities became the center of religious life, offering prayers for the kingdom's well-being, performing baptisms, weddings, and funerals, and providing a moral compass for the community. The abbey at Lindisfarne was one such holy site that served as a symbol of Christian authority. Its iconography, including the famous Lindisfarne Gospels, symbolized the union of Christian and Anglo-Saxon cultural identity. As the Anglo-Saxon kings navigated the turbulent political landscape of the early medieval world, their relationship with the church became essential for both their legitimacy and power. Kings understood that their rule was divinely ordained, and thus Christianity played a central role in justifying and consolidating their authority. The church provided a moral foundation for their reigns, and in return, kings were expected to protect and support Christian institutions. A key example of this dynamic was the role of church leaders, particularly bishops and abbots, in political life. These religious figures were often tasked with advising kings, and many were appointed to high-ranking political roles, such as governors of provinces.
In some cases, bishops even served as military leaders or advisors in royal courts. The Bishop of Winchester, for example, had substantial political and economic influence, controlling both church lands and royal estates. The church's land ownership played a significant role in shaping the Anglo-Saxon economy. Monasteries were major landowners, and as Christianity expanded, the church was granted vast estates by kings in exchange for spiritual benefits. This arrangement not only reinforced the church's power, but also ensured that royalty had political leverage over the clergy. By distributing land and wealth to the church, kings gained moral support and legitimacy for their rule, while the church became a stabilizing force within the kingdom. Yet, the relationship between church leaders and royalty was not always smooth. As the church's wealth grew, it began to exert more influence over the royal court, sometimes leading to tensions over matters of land rights, appointments, and political authority. Kings, like Aethelstan and Alfred the Great, carefully navigated these tensions, balancing their role as both spiritual protectors and secular rulers. Furthermore, the influence of church leadership extended beyond the royal court to the local level, where monasteries and churches acted as centers of power. They governed land, administered justice, and helped regulate trade, with the clergy acting as intermediaries between the king and the common people. The monasteries and church played a foundational role in the development of Anglo-Saxon England. From preserving the intellectual heritage of the Roman world to influencing the political and economic landscape, the church and its monastic communities were at the center of the kingdom's transformation. The relationship between the church and royalty was symbiotic, with kings relying on the moral authority and support of the church, while the church benefited from the political backing of the monarchy. The role of monasteries as educational hubs, cultural conservators, and spiritual centers was integral to the survival of Anglo-Saxon England's Christian identity, helping to shape the future of England long after the end of the Anglo-Saxon period.
The Viking raids on Anglo-Saxon England in the late 8th and 9th centuries were not just episodes of pillaging. They marked the beginning of a profound transformation in the Anglo-Saxon world. These raids, with their shock and awe tactics, strategic mobility, and brutal efficiency, exposed vulnerabilities in the Anglo-Saxon military structure and social order. But they also led to the eventual rise of more coordinated defenses, the rise of Alfred the Great, and the reshaping of Anglo-Saxon society. The first major Viking raid in 793 AD on the monastery of Lindisfarne shocked Anglo-Saxon England to its core. Lindisfarne, known as the Holy Island, was a sacred place, a spiritual center, and a symbol of the new Christian faith. It had long stood as a beacon of Christian worship and learning, and its pillaging by the Vikings was not just an attack on property, it was a direct assault on the very heart of Anglo-Saxon England's spiritual and cultural identity. The Vikings, seafaring raiders from the Scandinavian north, struck with speed, precision, and an unparalleled sense of terror. The raid at Lindisfarne was brutal. The monks were slaughtered or captured. The monastery was sacked, and the holy relics taken as spoils. This event was symbolic, a warning shot that pagan raiders from the north were not merely after gold and wealth. They sought to upend the Anglo-Saxons' way of life, challenging the dominance of Christianity and the social structures built upon it. Lindisfarne was only the beginning of a wider Viking assault on England's shores. Over the following decades, coastal settlements, especially monasteries, would be increasingly targeted. The Viking longships, which could navigate both open seas and shallow rivers, allowed them to strike deep inland, reaching places like Jarrow, Iona, and even Northumbria and East Anglia. The Vikings' speed, their lightning raids, and their ability to withdraw as quickly as they had attacked made them nearly impossible to counter.
The psychological toll of these raids was immense.
Anglo-Saxon society had relied heavily on monasteries for education, spiritual guidance, and cultural preservation. When these centers were destroyed, it was more than the loss of wealth, it was the disruption of Anglo-Saxon civilization itself. The Viking raids highlighted the fragility of this new Christian world and the vulnerability of Anglo-Saxon England to external attack. As the Vikings' attacks became more frequent and more sustained, their strategies evolved from hit-and-run raids to full-scale invasions. The Vikings, initially raiders, began to establish settlements and kingdoms in northern and eastern England, with York becoming a central stronghold. Their main advantage was their ability to move quickly and strike unpredictably from the sea, a force that the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms were unprepared to counter. The Anglo-Saxon response to these early raids was piecemeal at best. The Anglo-Saxon military system, based on the Fyrd, a local militia, was not well organized to face the scale of Viking invasions. When the Vikings began to invade in greater numbers, Anglo-Saxon kings struggled to mount a coordinated defense. The sword and shield walls of the Anglo-Saxon warriors were no match for the speed and coordination of the Viking forces. Enter Alfred the Great. Faced with the near collapse of Wessex, Alfred implemented a series of military reforms that transformed the way the Anglo-Saxons fought back. Alfred recognized that in order to defend Wessex, he needed to adopt more advanced military strategies. This included creating a network of fortified towns, known as burhs, across Wessex. These fortifications were built along key strategic points, ensuring that local populations had safe places to retreat and defend against Viking raids. One of Alfred's key military innovations was his naval strategy. He recognized the need to confront the Viking longships on their home ground, at sea. Alfred's construction of a fleet of ships was a game-changer, as it allowed his forces to counter Viking naval supremacy and cut off their ability to raid freely. Alfred's naval forces were fast, agile, and built to challenge the Viking longships directly. The Battle of Edington, fought in 878 AD, was the pinnacle of Alfred's military reforms. After a series of brutal Viking raids, Alfred faced Guthrum, the Viking warlord, and his forces in a decisive confrontation. Through a combination of military prowess and the defensive strength of his fortified burhs, Alfred secured a hard-fought victory. Guthrum was forced to agree to a peace treaty, which involved his conversion to Christianity. This victory ensured that Wessex remained independent, and it set the stage for future unification under Alfred's successors. The Viking raids on Anglo-Saxon England marked the beginning of an era of upheaval and change. The Vikings, with their superior naval tactics and their ability to strike swiftly, exposed the vulnerabilities of the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms. But the resilience of the Anglo-Saxons, embodied by figures like Alfred the Great, led to a revolution in military strategy that ultimately turned the tide against the invaders. The fortifications of burhs, the development of a naval fleet, and Alfred's leadership in military reforms allowed the Anglo-Saxons to adapt to the Viking threat. While the Vikings remained a powerful presence in England for decades, the Battle of Edington proved to be a turning point that allowed the Anglo-Saxons to secure their kingdoms, defend their culture, and ultimately lay the foundations for the unification of England. The Battle of Edington, fought in 878 AD, remains one of the most crucial moments in the history of Anglo-Saxon England. It was more than just a military clash. It was a defining moment in the ongoing struggle between the Anglo-Saxons and the Vikings, a contest for the survival of Wessex and the future of England itself. At the heart of this battle was Alfred the Great, who demonstrated unparalleled military genius in overcoming the forces of Guthrum, the Viking warlord. By the time of the battle, Wessex had endured years of Viking raids, and Alfred's kingdom was on the verge of collapse. Guthrum's Viking army, having ravaged much of the south of England, was poised to deal the final blow to Wessex. But Alfred, refusing to accept defeat, regrouped and took decisive action.
He knew that the battle would not just determine the fate of his kingdom, but could change the course of English history. The key to Alfred's success was his strategic foresight. Understanding that a direct assault on Guthrum's army would be folly, Alfred made the bold decision to lead his forces into battle at Edington, a location that offered tactical advantages. The terrain played a significant role in the battle, as the Anglo-Saxon army was able to make full use of the defensive positions provided by the land. Alfred's forces, strategically positioned, launched a surprise attack on the Viking forces, and in a decisive clash, they shattered the Viking defense.
The decisive victory at Edington was a turning point, not just because it drove the Vikings from Wessex, but because it solidified Alfred's reputation as a king capable of outsmarting even the most formidable foes. Guthrum, after his defeat, was forced to sign a peace treaty, which included his conversion to Christianity. This settlement was more than a military victory. It was a political triumph for Alfred, as it reinforced his authority, secured the Christian faith, and paved the way for a lasting peace with the Vikings in southern England. While the Battle of Edington ensured the immediate survival of Wessex, it was Alfred's military reforms that laid the groundwork for the future defense of England. Alfred understood that defeating Guthrum's Viking forces was only a temporary solution. In order to secure the future of Wessex and ultimately the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms, Alfred needed to rebuild and reorganize his military system. One of Alfred's most significant reforms was the creation of burhs, or fortified towns, throughout Wessex. The idea behind the burhs was simple but revolutionary. They would act as centers of defense where local populations could seek refuge in times of attack, and from which soldiers could be rapidly deployed. These fortifications were strategically placed at critical points in the kingdom, ensuring that no matter where a Viking attack came, Alfred's forces would be able to respond swiftly. Alfred's burhs were not just defensive structures. They were part of a broader defensive strategy that included well-coordinated communication and rapid mobilization of the Fyrd, the Anglo-Saxon militia. The Fyrd was reorganized under Alfred into a more effective and cohesive force, with local men trained and ready to take up arms when needed. This system meant that the kingdom was no longer relying on ad hoc responses to raids, but had a structured military capable of resisting large-scale invasions. Another key reform was Alfred's naval strategy. The Viking longships had been a significant advantage for the invaders, but Alfred built a fleet of ships capable of competing with Viking vessels. These fast, maneuverable ships gave Alfred the ability to challenge Viking supremacy on the water and defend his kingdom's coastlines. Alfred's ships were crucial in the defense of Wessex, and his naval reforms would later serve as a model for English naval forces in the centuries to come.
In addition to these military reforms, Alfred understood the importance of education and religion in maintaining social unity and loyalty. His commitment to learning and the preservation of Christian values helped to strengthen his rule and create a lasting legacy for future generations. Alfred also encouraged the translation of Latin texts into Old English, promoting literacy and intellectual growth across his kingdom. Alfred the Great's resilience and military genius were defining factors in the survival of Wessex and the eventual unification of England. The Battle of Edington was not just a victory on the battlefield, it was a catalyst for change, marking a turning point in the Anglo-Saxon struggle against Viking invaders. Alfred's military reforms, including the creation of burhs, the restructuring of the Fyrd, and the development of a naval fleet, laid the foundation for a stronger, more united England. Alfred's legacy as a leader extends far beyond his military victories. It is a legacy built on strategy, vision, and an unwavering commitment to the defense and education of his people. The Battle of Brunanburh in 937 AD marked a monumental turning point in the Anglo-Saxon struggle against the Viking and settlers who had plagued England for centuries. It was a battle not just for territory, but for the very soul of the nascent English kingdom. At the heart of this victory stood Aethelstan, King of Wessex and the first king of all England. His decisive role in the defeat of the Viking and Scottish forces at Brunanburh reshaped the future of England, marking the end of Viking domination and the beginning of a unified English kingdom. By the time Aethelstan ascended to the throne in 924 AD, the Viking presence in England was a major political and military force. The Vikings, led by Olaf Guthrafsson of Dublin and Constantine II, King of Scotland, had united in a bid to divide England once again. The Viking threat had evolved beyond raids. They had established strongholds in the Danelaw, and their rulers controlled large portions of northern and eastern England. The battle for supremacy in England was no longer just a local conflict. It was part of a wider struggle between Viking forces and Anglo-Saxon kingdoms vying for control of the British Isles.
The Viking forces at Brunanburh were a coalition, bringing together Viking Norwegian, Danish, and Scottish warriors. And it was this amalgamation of different cultures and military traditions that made them a dangerous foe. They sought to reclaim the lands they had once controlled and to break the unification efforts of the Anglo-Saxons. However, despite their numbers, their forces were not as cohesive as they appeared. Tensions existed within the coalition, and their military coordination would ultimately falter in the face of a more unified Anglo-Saxon army. When the battle began, Aethelstan's army was prepared, and his leadership would become a key factor in the decisive victory. The Anglo-Saxon army was composed of not just soldiers from Wessex, but also allies from Mercia, Northumbria, and Wales, showing the political alliances Aethelstan had forged over the years. His ability to unite such a diverse coalition was a testament to his diplomatic acumen and his vision of a united England. The battle itself was fought on open ground, with the Anglo-Saxons facing the Vikings head-on. Aethelstan's forces, despite being slightly outnumbered, held their position and used a series of strategic formations to withstand the initial Viking onslaught. Aethelstan's military tactics, honed from years of dealing with Viking incursions, involved using shield walls, ambush tactics, and combined arm strategies that leveraged both infantry and archers to break the Viking ranks. The decisive moment came when the Anglo-Saxons broke through the Viking defenses and forced the Viking and Scottish forces into retreat. Olaf Guthrafsson and Constantine II, both powerful rulers, were forced to flee the battlefield. This led to a decisive Anglo-Saxon victory, the aftermath of which saw the Viking threat in England significantly reduced. The consequences of Brunanburh were far-reaching. For Aethelstan, it marked the culmination of his reign as the first truly unified king of England. With the Viking coalition shattered, Aethelstan secured peace with the Vikings in the north, ensuring that there would be no more challenges to his rule from Viking kingdoms. Aethelstan's victory also meant the end of Viking influence in England. The battle symbolized the final defeat of Viking ambitions in the British Isles and marked the decline of Viking power.
The Viking defeat at Brunanburh solidified Aethelstan's position as the king of all England. He now held authority over a unified England, one that extended from the southern shores of Wessex to the northern reaches of Northumbria. The victory gave him the confidence and authority to implement reforms that would shape the future of the Anglo-Saxon state, including legal reforms, the promotion of Christianity, and the creation of an English identity. The victory at Brunanburh also brought a symbolic end to the Viking Age in England. It marked the collapse of the Viking Age and the fading of Viking influence over the English territories. With the defeat of the Viking armies, the Danelaw was weakened, and Viking rule in the north began to diminish. By ensuring the defeat of the Viking coalition, Aethelstan consolidated power and laid the foundation for a unified English monarchy. The battle itself was the culmination of generations of struggle, and the peace that followed allowed for the further integration of Viking settlers into Anglo-Saxon society. In the years to come, Aethelstan's successors would build upon his victories, leading England into an era of relative peace and prosperity. The Battle of Brunanburh was a defining moment in the history of Anglo-Saxon England. Under Aethelstan's leadership, the Anglo-Saxons defeated a powerful Viking coalition, securing Wessex and England for the first time. This battle not only marked the end of Viking domination, but also symbolized the beginning of a unified England under one crown. The defeat of the Vikings at Brunanburg solidified Athelstan's position as the first true king of all England and marked the decline of Viking power in the British Isles.
Anglo-Saxon literature is much more than a collection of written works. It is a mirror of the soul of Anglo-Saxon society. It offers a window into a world where bravery, loyalty, and honor were the cornerstones of identity, where Christianity was emerging as a transformative force, and where pagan traditions still cast a long shadow. At the forefront of this literary tradition stands Beowulf, the epic poem that encapsulates the essence of Anglo-Saxon heroism. Beowulf, the crown jewel of Anglo-Saxon literature, is a defining epic that provides not just a thrilling narrative of monster slaying, but a deep dive into the core values that shaped Anglo-Saxon life. The epic's structure and themes reflect an early society torn between its pagan past and its emerging Christian identity. The hero, Beowulf, is a man defined by his unwavering bravery in the face of seemingly impossible odds. His quest to rid the world of Grendel, Grendel's mother, and later the dragon isn't just about personal glory. Each battle speaks to a larger theme of self-sacrifice and duty to one's people and lord. Beowulf's unwavering loyalty to his king and kin underscores the deeply entrenched Anglo-Saxon ideals of honor and service. But the hero's fatal flaw lies in his recognition that no matter how great his deeds, his fate, or word, is inevitable. The final battle with the dragon symbolizes not just the end of Beowulf's life, but the passing of an era. A world where heroism was still defined by physical prowess, but where the future lay in the spread of Christian virtues. The Christian overlays in the poem are evident in Beowulf's motivations, his humility before God, and his allegiance to Christian principles of fate and destiny. The poem challenges the classical notion of heroism, making it moral and relatable while still preserving the pagan elements of strength and honor. This dynamic is part of what makes Beowulf so timeless, a clash between the old warrior culture and the rise of Christian morality.
While Beowulf represents the warrior ethos, Cynewulf's poetry, often overlooked in favor of the epic, offers a crucial piece of the Anglo-Saxon literary puzzle. Cynewulf was a poet who lived at a time when the Christian faith was gaining a foothold in Anglo-Saxon England, yet the vestiges of paganism were still prevalent. His works, such as Christ and Eleni, reflect the pivotal role of Christianity in Anglo-Saxon culture, while still recognizing and incorporating the traditions and values of the pagan warrior society. Cynewulf's poetry is distinctive for its religious fervor and its allusions to biblical stories. Yet the way in which he frames Christian themes within the context of heroic warrior narratives speaks to a culture still rooted in the importance of sacrifice, loyalty, and bravery. His poetic style, marked by elegant alliteration and rich, intricate verse, also helped preserve the Old English language, ensuring that these Christian teachings would have a lasting impact on Anglo-Saxon society. In works like Eleni, Cynewulf portrays Saint Helena, a Christian martyr, with the same reverence that might be shown to a pagan hero. By doing so, he bridges the gap between the Christian saints and the pagan gods, thus facilitating the transition from a world dominated by pagan warlords to one shaped by Christian ideals of love, forgiveness, and redemption. Unlike Cynewulf and Beowulf, Bede, also known as the Venerable Bede, was primarily a scholar and historian, and his ecclesiastical history of the English people remains one of the most important works of the Anglo-Saxon period. Written around 731 AD, Bede's history was more than just a record of the Church's growth.
It was a chronicle of England's transformation from a collection of warring tribes to a unified Christian kingdom. Bede's importance lies in his role as a cultural bridge. He helped to cement Christianity as a defining force in English society, marking a turning point from pagan warlordism to Christian governance. Bede's meticulous scholarship not only preserved key figures in Anglo-Saxon Christian history, but also served as a model of scholarly writing for future generations. His devotion to learning, faith, and the integration of Christian doctrine into English identity cannot be overstated. By linking the history of England to the broader Christian story, Bede's influence would extend well beyond his lifetime, shaping the way medieval English and later scholars would view the Christianization of their country.
In their own unique ways, Beowulf, Cynewulf, and Bede were pivotal to the development of Anglo-Saxon literature. Beowulf, with its epic portrayal of heroism, encapsulated the values of bravery, loyalty, and honor, while Cynewulf and Bede represented the intersection of the Christian faith with the old warrior ethos. Through these works, Anglo-Saxon literature not only preserved the past, but also shaped the cultural and religious fabric of medieval England. These poets and historians helped forge an identity that balanced the warrior's strength with the Christian's humility, offering a lasting legacy that continues to influence English culture and literature to this day. The art and architecture of Anglo-Saxon England provide a rich canvas for understanding the complex interplay between pagan and Christian influences during a time of profound transformation. From the intricate designs of metalwork and manuscript illumination to the enduring stone churches and monasteries that dotted the landscape, the Anglo-Saxons were not just warriors, but innovators, leaving behind a legacy that would shape the future of England. The Anglo-Saxons are perhaps best known for their exceptional metalwork, particularly in the 7th and 8th centuries, a time when both pagan and Christian symbols coexisted in the same artistic practices. The discovery of Sutton Hoo, one of the most famous archaeological sites in England, uncovered treasures that are still celebrated as prime examples of Anglo-Saxon metalwork. Gold, silver, garnets, and bronze were expertly crafted into weapons, brooches, purses, and helmets. The Sutton Hoo helmet, with its intricate animal motifs, is not only a striking example of warrior status, but also an artistic masterpiece that incorporates elements of both pagan mythology and emerging Christian iconography. These metal objects served both functional and symbolic purposes. For the Anglo-Saxon elite, they were marks of wealth and prestige, but they also symbolized the warrior code, bravery, honor, and loyalty. The ornate craftsmanship of these objects served as a visual representation of the Anglo-Saxon ideals, which balanced both the pagan heroism of old and the growing influence of Christian values of humility and faith. The metalworkers' intricate use of symbols, from interlaced designs to animal motifs, was a combination of art and spiritual belief, capturing the essence of an evolving society.
As Christianity began to take hold in Anglo-Saxon England, stone carvings became an important medium for expressing Christian themes while still retaining elements of Anglo-Saxon culture. The stone crosses and memorial stones found in churchyards and monasteries are prime examples of this fusion. Many of these stones, such as those found at Durham and Withorn, display intricate interlaced patterns, biblical stories, and Christian symbols, blending the old pagan artistic traditions with the new Christian imagery. One of the most notable features of Anglo-Saxon stone carvings is their portrayal of biblical scenes alongside traditional Anglo-Saxon designs, such as intricate knotwork and animal figures. This blending of the old and the new represents the syncretic nature of early Anglo-Saxon Christianity, where pagan artistic traditions were adapted to tell Christian stories. These carvings were not only decorative but also functional, marking holy sites and acting as educational tools for the largely illiterate population. The illumination of manuscripts became one of the most important forms of artistic expression in Anglo-Saxon England, especially after the Christianization of the kingdom. The monasteries became centers of learning, where scribes copied sacred texts and adorned them with vibrant illuminations. The Lindisfarne Gospels, an illuminated manuscript produced by the monk Eadfrith in the early 8th century, is perhaps the most famous example of Anglo-Saxon manuscript illumination. Its intricate decorative initials, interlaced patterns, and vibrant colors were designed to reflect the divinity and majesty of the Christian God, while also preserving the literary and theological knowledge of the time. Anglo-Saxons used manuscript illumination as a means of preserving not only Christian texts, but also their cultural identity. The art of manuscript illumination reflected a shift from pagan tradition, with manuscripts increasingly becoming a way to communicate not only faith, but also the moral and intellectual heritage of Anglo-Saxon society.
With the growth of Christianity, church architecture underwent a dramatic transformation. Early Anglo-Saxon churches were simple and functional, built of wood or wattle and daub. But as Christianity spread, stone churches began to take shape, especially in monastic centers like Jarrow and Lindisfarne. These stone churches, influenced by Roman basilicas, served both as places of worship and as symbols of the growing power of the Christian church in Anglo-Saxon society. The architecture of these early churches was designed not only to serve the spiritual needs of the community, but also to assert the authority of the church and its growing influence. Churches were often built on sites of pagan worship, symbolizing the Christian triumph over old beliefs. The layout of these churches, with their naves, apses, and central altars, reflected the Christian view of the world, a world where the spiritual and the earthly converged. In many ways, these churches were an embodiment of the Anglo-Saxon journey from paganism to Christianity. The art and architecture of Anglo-Saxon England were not merely aesthetic achievements. They were deeply intertwined with the cultural and religious transformations of the time. From metalwork to stone carvings, manuscripts, and churches, the Anglo-Saxons left behind a legacy that transcended their warrior ethos. Their ability to blend Christian faith with pagan traditions is seen in the artifacts and structures they created. These works of art not only reflect the values of the time, but also laid the foundation for the artistic traditions of medieval England, leaving an enduring influence on both the spiritual and cultural landscape of England for generations to come. The English language as we know it today is the result of centuries of change, shaped by complex waves of migration, conquest, and cultural exchange. At the core of this evolution lies the Anglo-Saxon period, a time when the Germanic roots of the language were solidified, and later the Viking invasions left an indelible mark. The shift from Old English to Middle English was deeply influenced by the encounter between Anglo-Saxons and Old Norse speakers, a cultural and linguistic collision that changed the course of the English language forever.
Old English was the foundation upon which later forms of English were built. Spoken between the 5th and 12th centuries, Old English evolved from the West Germanic dialects of the Angles, Saxons, and Jutes who settled in Britain. The language itself was highly inflected, with a system of cases, genders, and tenses that determined the relationships between words in a sentence. The syntax was flexible, allowing for a range of word orders, though the most common was subject, object, verb, SOV. At its core, Old English retained the Germanic characteristics of its ancestors, including a rich vocabulary associated with warfare, nature, family, and society. Words like hus, house, feather, father, and weapon reflect the society's deep connection to
to both family life and combat. The literature of the time, such as Beowulf, showcased a society proud of its pagan warrior ideals but beginning to adapt to the influences of Christianity. The Viking Age, beginning in the 8th century, dramatically reshaped Anglo-Saxon England, not just politically, but linguistically. As the Vikings settled in the Danelaw, they introduced their Old Norse language to the Anglo-Saxon populace. The Danelaw, the region in northern and eastern England controlled by Danish Vikings, became a linguistic melting pot, where Old Norse mingled with Old English in ways that were both subtle and profound. The impact on vocabulary was immediate and lasting. A great number of Norse words entered the Anglo-Saxon lexicon, particularly in areas like law, military life, and everyday commerce. Norse words like sky, egg, knife, and berserk became staples of everyday speech. The infusion of Old Norse vocabulary was particularly noticeable in the north of England, where Norse was spoken by the Viking settlers, influencing the speech of the Anglo-Saxon populations they interacted with.
However, the influence wasn't just lexical. Old Norse influenced the grammar and syntax of Old English in subtle ways. The simplification of verb conjugations in Old English, the reduction in the use of cases, and the shift toward a more fixed word order can be attributed to the influence of Old Norse. For example, Old Norse had simpler noun cases, and its influence may have led to the decline of the more complex Old English case system. In addition, Norse syntax also contributed to the adoption of auxiliary verbs like have and do in forming tenses, a feature still prominent in modern English today. Perhaps one of the most lasting consequences of the Viking invasions was the formation of regional dialects in England. Norse-speaking settlers in the Danelaw brought with them a different approach to language, one that would shape the dialects of northern England for centuries to come. The northern dialects of Middle English, which would later become the basis for much of modern English, were heavily influenced by Norse. The north-south linguistic divide that emerged during the Middle Ages can be traced to this period of Viking settlement. The northern dialect, with its characteristic pronunciations and vocabulary, was marked by the adoption of Norse forms for common words and even sentence structure. This linguistic divergence further cemented the idea of Norse-influenced English and laid the groundwork for later Middle English dialects. Although the Viking Age eventually came to an end, the linguistic changes they introduced had a profound, long-lasting impact on English. Even after the Norman Conquest in 1066, when Norman French became the language of the ruling class, many of the Norse-derived words and grammar patterns remained embedded in the vernacular of English speakers. The simplification of grammar, the introduction of new vocabulary, and the restructuring of the language's syntax continued to evolve into Middle English, which would eventually become the modern language we recognize today.
Moreover, the legacy of Viking influence can still be seen in the place names that dot the English landscape. Hundreds of towns and villages, particularly in the north and east of England, bear Norse-derived names, such as By, meaning town or village, and Thorpe, meaning farmstead. These place names serve as enduring reminders of the Viking settlers who once ruled over these lands and of the deep linguistic imprint they left behind. The Viking invasions may have been a violent and disruptive force, but their influence on the English language was transformative in ways that extended far beyond the battlefield. From Old Norse vocabulary to structural changes in grammar and dialectical evolution, the Viking legacy helped shape the English language into the dynamic, ever-evolving tongue it is today. The Anglo-Saxon and Norse-speaking peoples' coexistence and linguistic exchange laid the foundation for modern English, enriching it with a diverse vocabulary, a simplified grammatical system, and a unique syntax that would influence literature, culture, and identity for centuries.
The language of England thus became a testament to the convergence of two peoples, Anglo-Saxons and Vikings, whose linguistic contributions continue to echo through the words we speak today.
The Battle of Hastings in 1066 marked a definitive turning point in English history, one whose effects reverberated through the centuries. As the Norman conquest unfolded, it signaled the end of Anglo-Saxon England and the dawn of a new era dominated by Norman rule. Yet this battle, while pivotal, was not the culmination of events. It was the final act in a complex political drama and a battle of wits, strategy, and royal ambition. When Edward the Confessor, the last of the Anglo-Saxon kings, died in 1066, he left behind no heir. His death sparked a violent power struggle for the throne. Three contenders emerged: Harold Godwinson, the newly crowned King of England; William, Duke of Normandy, a distant cousin of Edward; and Harald Hardrada, a Viking king from Norway, who believed he had a legitimate claim through a pact made by his predecessor with a previous English king. Harold's coronation as king was initially accepted, but his claim to the throne was contested. William of Normandy argued that Edward had promised him the throne years earlier, and even though Harold had sworn an oath of loyalty to William, Harold's ascension was seen as a betrayal. Meanwhile, Harald Hardrada, believing his ties to the Viking kings gave him the right to rule England, landed in the north and began his invasion. For Harold, the news of the Viking invasion was a catastrophic blow. The Anglo-Saxon king swiftly marched his army to York and decisively defeated Hardrada at the Battle of Stamford Bridge in late September. Though victorious, Harold's forces were exhausted, and they had little time to rest before facing William's invading army in the south. When William's forces landed in Pevensey on the southern coast, they began assembling a well-coordinated army of Norman knights, archers, and infantry. While Harold had managed to raise an army from all corners of England, his forces were depleted and fatigued after the battle in the north.
On October 14, 1066, the two armies faced each other on Senlac Hill near Hastings. Harold's forces, positioned atop a hill, formed a shield wall, an iconic defense used by the Anglo-Saxons. Despite their formidable strength and preparation, the Anglo-Saxons were outmatched by William's tactical brilliance. William's forces were able to execute a series of feigned retreats, luring the Anglo-Saxons out of their defensive positions. The decisive moment came when Harold was struck in the eye by an arrow, a moment immortalized in the Bayeux Tapestry, and with his death, the Anglo-Saxon resistance crumbled. William's victory was not merely a military triumph, it was a strategic victory. His ability to combine cavalry, infantry, and archers into a coordinated assault, combined with the psychological tactics of feigned retreats, overwhelmed Harold's forces. The Battle of Hastings thus became not just a physical battle, but a battle of wits, where William's calculated use of his resources outclassed the exhausted and battle-worn Anglo-Saxons. The death of King Harold II at Hastings marked the collapse of the Anglo-Saxon monarchy. With Harold's defeat, William the Conqueror became the uncontested ruler of England. His Norman forces rapidly secured control over key regions of England, and the Anglo-Saxon nobility was either slaughtered, exiled, or replaced by Norman lords. The English language, culture, and legal systems were irrevocably transformed under Norman rule. The feudal system was introduced, redistributing land and power in a hierarchical manner where Norman lords held the vast majority of England's land, and the Anglo-Saxon peasants, or ceorls, became more deeply entrenched in their subservient roles. The Church, which had once enjoyed a degree of autonomy under the Anglo-Saxons, was restructured as Norman bishops were appointed, securing the Church's position as a political and religious tool for the monarchy.
The Norman introduction of castle building and the establishment of the Domesday Book, a comprehensive survey of land and resources, are examples of how Norman governance reshaped the administrative and physical landscape of England. Norman architecture, which included the construction of stone castles and fortifications, further solidified William's authority across the kingdom. The Battle of Hastings was more than just the final confrontation between two armies. It was the end of an entire way of life for the Anglo-Saxon people. The Norman conquest forever altered the landscape of England, replacing the Anglo-Saxon monarchy with a new Norman dynasty that would shape the future of the nation for centuries to come. The feudal system, the rise of Norman culture, and the Norman influence on the English language all stemmed from this pivotal battle. The victory at Hastings marked the beginning of a new chapter in English history, one that would define England's social structures, political institutions, and cultural identity for generations to come. The Anglo-Saxons, with their legacy of kingship, culture, and language, would eventually be absorbed into a broader Norman society, and England would be forever changed. The Norman conquest of 1066 was not merely a military victory. It marked a profound transformation in the political, social, and economic fabric of England. In the aftermath of William the Conqueror's triumph at Hastings, the landscape of England was irrevocably changed. But this shift wasn't simply the imposition of Norman rule on a subjugated people. Rather, it was a complex process of integration, adaptation, and synthesis, a delicate blending of Anglo-Saxon customs and Norman innovations that reshaped the kingdom. One of the most remarkable aspects of William's rule was how he incorporated and adapted Anglo-Saxon traditions into his newly established Norman feudal system. While the feudalization of land and power became the cornerstone of Norman England, the Anglo-Saxon system of land tenure was far from discarded. William the Conqueror used the existing Anglo-Saxon structures of landholding, but he imposed a new layer of feudal obligations that tied land to military service and loyalty to the king. The Wittenagemot, Anglo-Saxon Council of Nobles, gave way to the Curia Regis, a Norman royal court, but the role of local councils in decision-making remained intact, albeit under Norman supervision.
At the local level, Anglo-Saxon nobles retained their land, but were forced to swear loyalty to the king, often pledging military service in exchange for retaining their estates. While many of the Anglo-Saxon nobility were dispossessed and replaced with Norman lords, the feudal structures imposed by the Normans allowed local governance to remain, though it was now deeply tied to Norman feudal obligations. This delicate balance between Norman rule and Anglo-Saxon customs ensured a degree of continuity in the landholding system, which would have been crucial in maintaining stability within the kingdom. For the Anglo-Saxon peasantry, however, their relationship with land began to shift dramatically. While they were still tied to the land as serfs or tenant farmers, their rights became subject to Norman lordship, and their role in the social hierarchy was solidified through the feudal system. Despite these profound changes, certain Anglo-Saxon customs persisted within local communities. The local court systems, including trial by oath and witness testimony, were maintained, even as Norman legal practices gradually took hold at the royal level. The Domesday Book, commissioned by William the Conqueror in 1085, is one of the most remarkable historical documents ever produced. It was not just an inventory of land and resources, it was a tool of political control that reinforced Norman authority over England. The Domesday Survey systematically recorded who held land, what resources each estate had, and what obligations were owed to the crown, making it an essential instrument for William to solidify his reign. Before the Norman conquest, land tenure in Anglo-Saxon England was governed by a mixture of customary law and local agreements, with land passed down through familial lines and royal grants. The Domesday Book transformed this system by creating a centralized record of land ownership that allowed William to exercise absolute control over the kingdom's wealth. The document revealed the extent of the Norman redistribution of land, where lands once held by Anglo-Saxon nobility were now given to Norman lords loyal to William.
The Domesday Book also had profound implications for taxation. By cataloging the land holdings and resources of the kingdom, William created a system that could be used to determine tax rates and feudal duties. This system ensured that the Norman crown could extract maximum resources from the kingdom, while also securing the loyalty of Norman vassals, who now held the land directly from the king. The taxation system became increasingly centralized, with the Norman elite ensuring that the flow of wealth and resources was directed towards the royal treasury. For the Anglo-Saxon peasants, the Domesday Book solidified their subjugation within a feudal system that left them at the mercy of Norman landowners. Though many of them still worked the land as serfs, their rights were now dictated by Norman law, and they had no recourse to the more egalitarian Anglo-Saxon practices of landholding and inheritance. The aftermath of the Norman Conquest was a period of profound transformation in English society. William the Conqueror's ability to integrate Anglo-Saxon customs into a Norman feudal system allowed for the continuity of essential land tenure practices, while simultaneously ensuring the imposition of Norman control. The Domesday Book played a pivotal role in this transformation, acting as both a tool for governance and a method of establishing fiscal control over the kingdom. As the Normans solidified their rule, the Anglo-Saxon monarchy was replaced by a centralized feudal system that would shape English society for centuries to come. Yet, within this shift, remnants of Anglo-Saxon culture remained embedded in local practices, reminding us that the Norman conquest was as much about adaptation as it was about conquest. The Norman conquest of 1066 irrevocably transformed the political, social, and cultural landscape of England, but it did not erase the deep-seated Anglo-Saxon legacy that had shaped the kingdom for centuries. Instead, the Normans, led by William the Conqueror, wisely integrated many Anglo-Saxon practices into their newly established rule, ensuring that much of the Anglo-Saxon culture, language, and legal traditions endured under their governance. The lasting influence of the Anglo-Saxon period on medieval England is evident in several key areas, including law, land tenure, language, and religion. One of the most striking continuities after the Norman conquest was in the legal system. Although Norman law introduced new concepts like feudal obligations and vassalage, many Anglo-Saxon legal traditions continued to play a vital role in Norman governance. The concept of local justice, where the community participated in resolving disputes, remained ingrained in England's judicial system.
For example, the Wergeld, a compensation system for bodily injury or murder, continued to be a feature of the Norman legal system. This practice, which had been central to Anglo-Saxon society, allowed individuals or families to settle disputes with monetary compensation instead of seeking violent retribution. Though the Normans had their own laws concerning property, land, and inheritance, the Anglo-Saxon influence persisted, especially in the local courts where justice was dispensed at the village level. Similarly, trial by ordeal and trial by combat, methods used by the Anglo-Saxons to determine guilt or innocence, lingered in certain forms in the early years of Norman rule. These customs, though gradually phased out, represent how Anglo-Saxon legal principles were incorporated into Norman governance, illustrating the continuity of some practices amidst the dominance of Norman law. Perhaps one of the most lasting legacies of the Anglo-Saxon period is the English language itself. The Norman conquest brought with it the widespread use of Norman French, especially among the nobility, the church, and the royal court. Yet the language spoken by the majority of the population, the Anglo-Saxon dialects, remained dominant in everyday life. The Normans themselves recognized the importance of the English language, and over time, Old English and Norman French merged to create Middle English. This process of linguistic fusion didn't merely result in a mix of vocabulary. It also introduced new ways of organizing thought and speech. Many Old Norse words, along with Latin borrowings from the Norman Church, entered the English language, leading to profound changes in grammar and syntax. For instance, English began adopting a more fixed word order, which was a feature of Norman French, as opposed to the more flexible structure of Old English. Place names throughout England also bear the marks of the Norman influence, with many towns adopting the French suffixes such as ton, ville, and court, even though these names were rooted in Anglo-Saxon landholding patterns. This linguistic blending cemented the coexistence of Anglo-Saxon and Norman influences, shaping the English language into the rich, dynamic tongue we recognize today.
While the Normans introduced the feudal system to England, they did so with an understanding of existing Anglo-Saxon governance structures. Prior to the Norman conquest, land in Anglo-Saxon England was granted in exchange for loyalty and military service, a system that resembled feudalism in many ways. William the Conqueror did not entirely discard the Anglo-Saxon system, but instead imposed his own version, which maintained local governance while creating a system of centralized royal authority. The Normans took the existing Anglo-Saxon system of land tenure and adapted it to their feudal model. Anglo-Saxon lords were often replaced by Norman vassals, but the hierarchical landholding structure remained intact, with William as the ultimate overlord. Anglo-Saxon peasants continued to work the land, though their obligations now extended to Norman lords under feudal conditions. This continuity ensured a smoother transition from Anglo-Saxon rule to Norman rule, allowing Norman control to become more embedded in the existing structures of Anglo-Saxon society. One of the most enduring legacies of Anglo-Saxon society was its relationship with the Church. The Anglo-Saxon Church had become deeply entrenched in the political and social life of the kingdom, and after the Norman conquest, the Church remained a powerful force. While the Norman conquest brought about a change in leadership, with Norman bishops replacing Anglo-Saxon clergy, the Christian faith that had been firmly established in England remained the same. In fact, William used the Church as a key pillar of his authority. By appointing Norman clergy to important ecclesiastical posts, he ensured that church leaders were aligned with his rule, and the Norman Church became an extension of Norman governance. However, the Anglo-Saxon legacy of a strong Christian identity persisted, influencing how both the Anglo-Saxon and Norman populations interacted with the Church. The Anglo-Saxon Church's role in education and literature was carried forward under Norman patronage, ensuring that learning and religious life continued to thrive in medieval England.
The Anglo-Saxon legacy lived on long after the Norman conquest. Through language, legal systems, landholding practices, and the Church, elements of Anglo-Saxon culture continued to shape the English identity. The Normans, while radically altering the political landscape of England, recognized the strength of the existing Anglo-Saxon systems and were pragmatic in incorporating them into their own rule. This fusion of cultures allowed for a smoother transition from the Anglo-Saxon to the Norman period, ensuring that the Anglo-Saxon legacy endured, influencing the development of medieval England for centuries to come.